At this time, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the 2016-2017 Distinguished Faculty Member, Dr. David Crutchley. David is a native of Zimbabwe who joined our faculty in 2004. He is a professor of religion and chair of that department. Prior to Carson-Newman, he was a New Testament professor and dean of theology at Southwestern. Before that, he and his wife Carol spent 14 years with the Emmanuel Mission Board at the Baptist Seminary in Cape Town, South Africa. He earned both undergraduate and professional legal degrees at the University of Rhodesia before earning the MDiv and PhD from Southwestern. David is fluent in 6 languages, and his education includes Oxford University, Boston College, and the London Institute of Contemporary Studies with John Stott. Admired here and abroad, respected by colleagues, loved by his students, even including the ones who find him extremely breathtakingly difficult. In fact, one student who nominated Dr. Crutchley for this distinguished position said, "He pushes students to be the best they can possibly be and builds a personal relationship with each." Our own Dr. Ross Brahman has said, "David models the convergence of head and heart like few followers of Jesus whom I have ever met. His mental acuity combines with a deep and authentic piety in a manner that says, this is what being a true disciple looks like." It is my pleasure to introduce this year's Distinguished Faculty Lecturer, Dr. David Crutchley.
The canvas is wide and deep. Africa's physical features are impressive. She is the second largest continent in the world, with an area of 11.7 million square miles, covering 22% of the world's surface. You can see the United States of America fits in easily, so does China and Eastern Europe. This continent is surrounded by 2 massive bodies of water with their own personalities. The frigid, icy Atlantic on the west, and the balmy Indian Ocean on the east. The Nile, the longest river in the world, with its 2 sources in the Ethiopian highlands and in Lake Victoria, meanders out into the Mediterranean Sea after a journey of some 4,000 miles. Ironically, the Sahara Desert, which is equivalent to the continental United States of America, lies adjacent to Egypt's artery of life. The continent stretches from the Cape of Good Hope in the south to Cairo in the north, a distance of some 4,200 miles. Roughly the same distance from east to west, from Somalia, the Horn of Africa, in the east to Dakar, Senegal in the west. Though the topography of Africa is spectacular, its history is one of contradictions. Kenyan-born Ali Mazrui explores 6 fundamental contradictions, paradoxes, in his book, The African Condition. First, the paradox of habitation. Africa is the earliest habitat of humankind, but in a sense the last to become truly habitable. Mazrui remarks that the most probable cradle of civilization is still beautiful, but the scars of the original sin are in evidence. The Garden of Eden is in disrepair. Second, the paradox of humiliation. Africans are not necessarily the most brutalized of all peoples, but they are almost certainly most humiliated in modern history. Princeton social ethicist Peter Paris speaks to the 3.5 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. He calls it the European crime against humanity. He goes on to say that it is a conservative estimate that 25 million Africans were stolen from their homeland, packed like sardines into the bellies of slave ships, and if they endured the suffering hell of the so-called Middle Passage, was sold on auction blocks to the highest bidder. Third, the paradox of acculturation. African societies are not the most or the closest to the Western world, culturally speaking, but they have been undergoing the most rapid westernization in the last 100 years of any continent. Africa is a cultural bazaar, a wide variety of ideas and values drawn from different civilizations that compete for the attention of potential African buyers. On the religious front, the battle of the gods plays out between the drum, African traditional religion, the cross, Christianity, and the crescent, Islam. For the soul of Africa, Mazrui warns that in this theater of cultural exchange, the greatest danger to Islam is not Western Christianity, but Western secularization. It's not the passion of the cross, but the apostasy of modernity. It is not the church of Christ, it is the altar of materialism. African traditions and values in the rural setting are confronted daily with the seductive whisper of postmodern and Western trends practiced in the city and urban centers. Often Africa's cultural heritage is modified or abandoned, and the relevant questions become, how African is African culture? The answer depends on where you stand in the continent. Fourth, the paradox of retardation. Africa is not the poorest of the regions of the world in resources, but it may well be technically the least developed. The African larder is stocked with an abundance of natural resources, but the pantry has too often been raided by the Western world. Today, Africa is bleeding. The infrastructure in many parts is in serious decay. When the European countries left Africa, much of the skilled labor force departed with the inevitable drain. Now rust and dust characterize its crumbling infrastructure. Roads, railway lines, and communications are in sad shape. Julius Nyerere, past president of Tanzania, remarked back in his day that when the great powers were trying to get to the moon, Africans were trying to get to their village and are still trying to get to their village. And if they get to their village, find it extremely difficult to get back to the city center. Potholes in the roads of Africa and parts of Africa stand as one witness to the decay of the infrastructure. In Uganda, there's a joke that if you drive down Kampala Road, there are so many potholes. If you see somebody driving straight, they must be drunk. Fifth, the paradox of fragmentation. Africa is by no means the smallest continent physically, but it is most definitely the most fragmented politically. Seldom does Africa act with one will or one voice because of its national, ethnic, ideological, and religious cleavages. Africa has approximately 27% of the world's languages, 2,000 languages. The European Union has 23. Sixth, the paradox of location. Africa is the most centrally located continent in the globe physically, but it is probably the most peripheral and marginalized politically. Africa is the only continent bisected by the equator and traversed by the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Masri states, however, that the limited influence on the world stage can be attributed to technological underdevelopment, organizational incompetence, and a weak military. Nevertheless, Africa is on the adventure of modernity and travels not as a galley slave, but as a passenger with hope. No doubt she will frame different questions, and Hegel's idealistic philosophy will gain little traction in Africa's traditional thinking. The African peoples demand to be seen and recognized, and through not the images reflected in Western mirrors, but as they really are and want to be. Africa is a continent familiar with paradox, contradictions, seeming contradictions, and with crises. It is no stranger to John's apocalyptic vision, that vision of the seals being broken and unleashing that cataclysmic destruction at the midnight of human history. In a real sense, we discover that the apocalyptic horsemen seem to have left their imprints and footprints on the soil of Africa already. The first rider on the white horse symbolizes military conquest. The scramble for Africa began in earnest at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 85. 14 of Europe's leaders, including the Iron Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, gathered to carve up and partition this African continent like pieces and slices of cake. Not a single African leader was invited to the table. These self-appointed European leaders redrew the map of Africa with impunity. Lines of longitude and latitude, arcs of circles, were drafted in the smoking rooms of Europe, reflecting little understanding of the culture or little concern for the tribal topography of the continent. The French Prime Minister in that day admitted, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." These amateur cartographers ended up with some 10,000 African polities amalgamated together into 40 European countries and protectorates. The rapacity of the European leaders knew no bounds. The Belgian king, Leopold II, helped himself to the Congo Free State. This became his private fiefdom. It was nearly 1 million square miles, 75 times the size of Belgium. 1/13 of the size of Africa. Polish-born novelist Joseph Conrad later witnessed the Belgian atrocities in the Congo, and he stigmatized the continent forever with the title of his classic book, The Heart of Darkness, in 1899. The big men, the tyrants of Africa, have learned well from Europe's example of plunder, and the continent to this day is haunted by endemic corruption. The Zaire's Caligula, Mobutu Sese Seko, who seized power through the barrel of the gun in 1963 and was driven into exile in 1997, is a case in point. His insatiable looting of his own country knew no limits, and he boasted, "The chief is the chief, the eagle that flies high above, and the spit of the toad cannot touch him." With his country languishing in poverty, he built a private residence deep into the equatorial forests of the Congo back in the 1980s at a cost of $100 million, and even had a runway outside his palace where the supersonic Concorde could land. The scourge of ethnic hostility and tribalism make up the deadly trappings of the second rider on the red horse. In a chapter, "The Graves Are Not Yet Full," Norman Meredith documents the Rwandan crisis and tragedy, the 100 Days of Madness in April of 1994. In Rwanda, the land of 1,000 hills, the land of Diana Fossey's Gorillas in the Mist, the land that boasted of a Christian population where there was morality respected, tribalism became the ideology of politics, a politics mired in blood. Speaking to a group of Rwandan Catholic leaders after the genocide of April 94, the papal envoy, Edward Roger Echegari, admitted the blood of tribalism proved stronger than the waters of baptism. Tribal wars, genocide, sponsored by groups like Boko Haram in West Africa and the Al-Qaeda affiliate Mullah Thamin Brigade, the masked ones in North Africa, has turned parts of the continent into a massive refugee camp. Tokomombo Adeyemo, who was born into a royal Muslim home and later on in Western Nigeria and later on embraced Christianity, laments a new class of people in Africa. He says this class that has emerged is called the in-between people, ruthlessly uprooted from their places of birth. Thousands of refugees roam aimlessly in the urban centers of Africa. They are not only homeless and jobless, but for the most part, they are hopeless. Refugees, people voting with their feet. The third rider gallops across the stage of Africa on a black horse, carrying with him drought and consequent famine. The granaries of Africa are often empty because of the caprice of the climate and because of the poor quality of the soils. Few of us can forget the horrific famine of biblical proportions in Ethiopia in 1984 through 85, which left 1 million people dead in its wake. The fourth rider on the pale horse has opened the deadly file of disease throughout the continent. AIDS, the scourge of AIDS, tore the social fabric of Africa into pieces. The unexplained deaths at Carson-Newman, a village on the Lake of Victoria, and close to the Tanzanian border, the place, the haunt of smugglers and bar girls in the 1980s, seemed to be the flashpoint of this lethal plague. The disease left Africa with 11 million orphans. Children, not even adolescent, were raising children. By 2004, some 20 million people had died from AIDS and 30 million people were infected. At one time, Botswana had the highest infection rate in the world, with more than 37% of its population HIV positive, and it recorded an average life expectancy of 27. Antiretroviral drugs offer hope today, but the continent encounters new threats with Ebola and old enemies and foes like malaria and diarrhea continue to contribute to the high infant mortality rate. Even today in Africa, it is easier to get a bottle of beer than a glass of clear water. Against such a dark sky, Africa leans into the 21st century with the aspirations of a renaissance. Coupled with this African dream is hope born out of the startling fact that sub-Saharan Africa has taken to Christianity in an astounding way. Edward Blyden wrote at the turn of the 20th century that the vacuity of European life, trapped within its ghetto of materialism, will pass from the scene, and there is the potential for the African continent to become the spiritual conservatory of the world. With the recession of Christianity in the West, the principal theaters of Christianity have shifted to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Philip Jenkins, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, has said to us that in 2025, Africa or Latin America will vie for the most Christian continent in the world. By 2050, 1 out of 5 Christians will be non-Latino and white. Andrew Walls, a British historian of missions, reminds us that a theology that matters is a theology where the people are. No doubt Africa will offer us an earthy and subversive spirituality that will challenge the traditions of the West. Those who stand on the Northern Hemisphere may ask pointed questions. What does an African worldview, with its concepts, customs, and wisdom, have to offer the West? Why does the West have to drink from the spiritual wells of Africa? What does this new theology growing in the African womb have to offer the first world? The answer begins with the gift of Ubuntu, the gift of relationship and humaneness. The former president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, stated, "Let the West have its technology and Asia its mysticism. Africa's gift to the world will be human relationships." African culture is in essence relational. It's the glue that holds the community together. There's an African saying that articulates this phenomenon: a person is a person through other persons. The Zulu or Xhosa word for Ubuntu, that word Ubuntu, encompasses the other and approximates to humaneness, compassion, fellow feeling. The African alternative to René Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is the African axiom, I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am. John Mbedi writes, as the elder statesman of Africa, only in terms of other people does the individual become conscious of his or her own being, duties, privileges, and responsibilities towards himself or herself and towards other people. South African theologian Denise Ackerman writes too, In this boundless human web, I acquire my humanity as something which comes to me as a gift, shaped and nurtured in and through the humanity of others. I can only exercise my humanity by being in relationship with others, and there is no growth or happiness or fulfillment apart from human beings. Such sentiment challenges Western thinking with its pursuit of rugged individuality and its touted self-sufficiency. We have inherited the spirit of the Enlightenment that fosters a competitive and comparative approach to life and leaves little room at the crowded inn for others, and little inclination for us to be our brothers or sisters' keeper. In turn, we often walk the road of life alone. Many of us have witnessed the crowded city streets and congested undergrounds of America and Europe that traffic in a humanity bereft of connection, bonding, and belonging. Nobel laureate Archbishop Tutu reminds us a solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. A totally self-sufficient human being is subhuman. We are made for complementarity. I have gifts that you have not. You have gifts that I have not. Voila, Tutu says. We need each other to become fully human. We are all caught up in this bundle of life, and the summum bonum, the greatest good, is interdependence. Ubuntu is a rule of conduct and a social ethic. An African proverb that captures the spirit of Ubuntu goes like this: the reason that two antelopes walk together is so that the one may blow the dust out of the other's eyes. To use Tennyson's classic phrase, in a world of nature red in tooth and claw, Ubuntu offers a cup of cold water and a listening heart. The road of life today is treacherous. The valleys are steep, the valleys are deep, and the mountains are steep. Day-to-day survival is the goal of many of our lives. Ubuntu offers the handshake of humaneness. Civil rights activist Martin Luther King understood the Ubuntu spirit. In his sermon on being a neighbor, the African-American prophet thundered, "No longer can we afford the luxury of passing by on the other side. Such folly," he said, "was once called a moral failure. Today," he continues, "it will lead to a universal suicide. I must not ignore the man on life's Jericho road." To add, the woman on life's Jericho road. He is part of me and I am part of him. His agony diminishes me and his salvation enlarges me. End of quote. People are more important than ideas. According to Jesse Mugambi at the University of Nairobi, he argues that Africans live rather than articulate, verbalizing their theology. Under the apartheid regime in South Africa, the ideals of Ubuntu were eviscerated. The native was a problem and not a person, condemned to an environment that violated human dignity at every corner, from inferior education to the despised work permit. Augustine Schutter declares Ubuntu is almost the exact opposite of apartheid. We do not stand free of guilt. Our own Western narcissism is illustrated in a simple life practice. Tutu chides our perfunctory greeting of a stranger. Shortly after the introduction, we ask the question, "What do you do?" and often the stranger's answer determines his or her value in my estimate. Tutu, Africa's Amos in a sense, proclaims in one of his sermons, God does not love us because we are lovable, but we are lovable because of the fact that God loves us. We find our worth in God's love. So we are liberated then, if that's where we find our worth, from the pursuit of trying always and desiring to achieve and to impress. We are the children of divine love, and nothing can change that fundamental fact about us. A theology of presence evolves out of the anthropological African insight of Ubuntu. That compassionate touch serves notice to our world that we are on a redemptive mission. Jean-Marie Ella, a theologian out of the Cameroon, cries out from the African context, Jesus died so that people may stand upright. That is the center of the gospel message. The principle of compassion resonates with the mandate Jesus gave to each one of us. Our responsibility is to break the shackles of selfishness, and the onus is on us to listen to the voices of brokenness that we encounter daily on the way of life. We need to dismantle the walls of our own arrogance and the barriers of our own self-centeredness. As Paul Loeb, the associate scholar at Seattle's Center for Ethical Leadership, remarked, if we focus solely on our own experiences, we will hear nothing but the echoes of our own obsessions. But if we look for ties to a broader common story in which we all partake, we can develop the vision we need. Some may rightfully raise questions and concerns regarding the notion of Ubuntu and the actual practice of Ubuntu on the continent. For example, how do we protect unique rights of the individual in a community where the needs of the many seem to trump the needs of the few? Where are the avenues, one might ask, for self-determination and self-expression found in the strange land of Ubuntu? Does Ubuntu enable parasitic and destructive relationships of codependency? Princeton graduate Michael Battle, who spent several years in South Africa under the tutelage of Tutu, remarked with these words, that we now need a community-centered worldview, and that does not require the obliteration of the individual person. He writes, God does not call us to be colorblind or to pretend that we do not see each other as different. God made us intentionally and beautifully different, and I might add with different accents. Difference makes creation healthy and illustrates that humanity is inextricably linked together. Other legitimate concerns include how the African worldview squares with the realities and crises of the continent. How does Ubuntu flourish in the soil of tribalism and corruption that bedevil the continent? The balkanization of Africa, according to tribal alliances, attacks the very vision of a unifying worldview of Ubuntu, and the ubiquitous corruption of theft from the weakest in the nation, the voiceless, the newborn, the elderly, the poor, and the disabled. In the past, no one ate in Africa unless all ate together, for the needs of the individual were the needs of the community. But too often today, African leaders are eating sumptuously while their people are starving. The U.S. ambassador to Zaire, Daniel Sampson, recalled the rapacious appetite of Mobutu. He noted, Mobutu had not only killed the goose that laid the golden eggs, but he had eaten the carcass and made fat out of its feathers. The issue of gender equality seems to have also fallen afoul in Africa, and the tenet that a person is a person through other persons appears to operate more persuasively if it is an African man to an African man. The continent has 54 countries, and to this day only 5, Burundi, Central African Republic, Gabon, Liberia, and Malawi, have appointed women as heads of state or acting prime ministers. Mercy Oduyoye, a Ghanaian theologian, yearns for a new day and describes it through the metaphor of weaving. I dream, she says, of a new kente cloth, a new tapestry to symbolize the equal value of men and women. Notwithstanding its flaws, Ubuntu provides significant social capital, knowing that we need someone close, knowing that we need someone else, does not allow us to be isolated in comfortable places to the detriment of others, but pushes us to seek to build bridges to places and people who we are ignorant of and estranged from. The beatitude of Ubuntu, I in you and you in me, solicits risk. Professor Tony Balcom at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa writes provocatively of crossing boundaries and building bridges. He employs the metaphor of translation to explain the process. He draws on the pre-Enlightenment Aristotelian idea of habitus, habit, arguing that it has more to do with the heart than with the head. The habit, that thing that we do without thinking, which is part of our makeup and our character. He contends that translation requires 3 things. Translation requires first transformation, moving from one form into another. Second, it requires otherness, moving from one form into an other. Third, it requires vulnerability, being willing to change. Change, in its very definition, is a kind of death, the death of one form as it is transformed into another. The Christian message is at heart one of profound translation. The incarnation, divine divinity cloistered in humanity, provides theological grounding and precedent for translation. When God became flesh, when he was transformed into a man, when he reached out with otherness to others as the other, the Son of Man, and accepted the vulnerability of the suffering Son of Man, Son of God on the cross, the impossibility and scandal of that translation. Ubuntu embraces the path of translation. The journey carries risk, however, and it is not for the faint of heart, but it warms the Creator's heart. Friki Conradi grew up on a farm in the Western Transvaal, a farm heritage that was steeped in traditional Afrikaner thinking. It was a safe place for him, where no questions were asked about that divinely ordained right and the need for whites to rule over blacks in South Africa. Even when he went to university at Potchefstroom and sat in on a theology class, no one ever asked those particular questions that related to race. But Friki Conradi started to ask questions, and when he started, he never stopped. He became the first white ever to refuse to be ordained in the white branch of the Dutch Reformed Church. He was ordained instead in a segregated black church. Then he did the unimaginable. He went and served a congregation in the volatile and dangerous black township of Alexandria on the edge of the city of Johannesburg. He received the salary of a black pastor, and would not accept the subsidy offered to white missionaries. He did not regard himself as a missionary bringing the light, but as one receiving it from the people he served. They take you as a racist and as a paternalist, he said in an interview in February 1982, and then they turn you and make you into a human being. Within a week of that interview, Frikkie Conradie was tragically killed in a car accident at the age of 35, 12 hours before his wife gave birth to their first child. His wife, Mariki, requested that he be laid to rest where he had tried to live in the black community. He was the first white to be buried in the black cemetery in Alexandria. And as far as anyone knows, he is the only white person to be buried in a cemetery, a black cemetery in South Africa. His Afrikaner relatives, many of whom had shunned him when he had gone down this direction, came to his funeral. They all gathered in the little black church. It was small, and an overflow crowd was there, and hundreds of black mourners outside the church windows. What spark lit the flame of this remarkable demonstration of Ubuntu, of translation, of reaching out to the others? What was the catalyst? It was a single night in the Netherlands when Frikkie Conradie began to fall into a conversation with a fellow student from South Africa. Under South African law, that student that Conradie was talking to was a colored, a person of mixed race by the name of Alan Boesak. Alan Boesak and Frikkie Conradie began to converse, and Boesak asked Conradie what he thought of the racist policies of apartheid in South Africa. Conradie responded with the conventional guarded answer about how the system was not necessarily inconsistent with Christian precepts. The two men dialogued all the way through the night, and Boesak reminded and recounted to Conradie the traumatic forced removals that he had experienced and his family had experienced in the Cape Province under the apartheid era. In that same interview of February 1982, before his tragic death, Conradie admitted, "I met Alan that night, and that's where the whole story starts." Desmond Tutu and Alan Boesak spoke at Conradie's funeral. They both remarked, first Tutu, here was an ambassador of Christ, one who lived out a costly form of reconciliation. Boesak spoke in eulogy, "I do not come to praise Frikkie Conradie, but I come to praise God for the life of Frikkie Conradie. Frikkie Conradie lived and died," Boesak said, "a freed man. Oh, that we might learn to live more freed as men and women who would be willing to jump over that picket fence, to cross over that picket fence, and throw away our own self-centeredness."
And if I might be as bold to say, oh, that we might come to realize that Africa does not need us as much as we need Africa. Thank you.